All right, so just to get the elephant out the room, I'm obviously not in my normal setting. I'm at the Children's Mercy Hospital. My daughter just had her second of three heart surgeries. She's about 5 months, almost 6 months old now. Thankfully, everything went really well. We expect to return home any day now. So I appreciate the prayers. All right, so three different things I want to talk about today in this video. The first thing is I just watched the Penn State SMU game. So I want to talk about Penn State first. The second part of the video, I want to talk about SMU and the ACC just in general, just all of that in one big glob. And then the third part of the video, I want to talk about the College Football Playoff Committee and how these first couple of games makes them look. All right, so first, let's talk about Penn State. Penn State, I don't think is a great team. I'm just going to put that out there. I think that they are the typical vanilla Big Ten football team. I think their quarterback is slightly above average. And then the rest of their team is built just like the prototypical, stereotypical Big Ten football team. They love to run the ball first. If they get a nice lead on you, the game's pretty much over. And their defense is pretty stout. And then obviously they play outdoors in cold environments, which makes it uncomfortable for SEC and ACC schools. Typical Big Ten football. Penn State is the one team that's been towards the top of the rankings all season that I really have not respected. Even though they did beat the brakes off of SMU, I still don't feel any different about Penn State because I honestly feel like SMU beat themselves. And I also feel like SMU almost didn't belong in the field of 12. And I know some folks are going to be like, man, he's killing Penn State. I'm not here to do that. I'm not a big believer in who they are, what they have, what they're doing, their coach, their quarterback, just not a big believer in it. At the same time, I will say this. I've mentioned on this channel before that I believe the Big Ten is going to go on a similar run to what the SEC did with Alabama, LSU, Florida, Georgia, like this 15 or so year run that the SEC went on. I think the Big Ten is going to do that over the next 20 years or so. I think the Big Ten is in prime position to rule college football for the next 20 years if everything stays like it's staying. Meaning if they don't just put all the teams in one big conference or something weird like that, I think the Big Ten is going to be dominant. So is Penn State a bad team? No, they're definitely not a bad team. I think they're a pretty good Big Ten team, which makes them a good team overall throughout the country. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying. I just feel like when it comes to the elite teams and the really good teams, I don't think Penn State really is in that category. Once again, though, if you put if you put Penn State in the Big 12, I think they'd run the table. If you put Penn State in the ACC, I'm pretty sure they will be locked into the ACC championship over the next few years. But when you put them in the SEC or the Big Ten, I don't think that they're really competing like that. So that's my thoughts on Penn State. Now let me talk about SMU and ACC teams in general. So in my eyes, the ACC stands for Annoying Coastal Conference. This conference is so annoying to me, and I'll explain why. It's exactly what we saw from SMU just a little bit ago in this Penn State game. What they have always done, and this includes my favorite team, the Miami Hurricanes, what they seem to always do is they play perfect, near perfect, against other ACC teams. And then when they play against the SEC or the Big Ten, sometimes the Big 12, they just like lay down and beat themselves. And I know, they just make like all of these critical errors that just beat themselves the entire game. I don't know why that is. It annoys me like crazy, but it's just what ACC schools do. When they play against other ACC schools, they're making one-hand catches. Their time management is perfect. They're making 55-yard field goals. They're doing everything perfectly. But once they go and play against Texas or OU or something like that, they just lay down and they just do stuff to make you go, they didn't do that all season. What are they doing? Like today, SMU's quarterback, I think he had 8 interceptions all year, and he had 3 interceptions in the first half today. 2 of those were pick sixes. Like you just lost in the first quarter doing that, because if you get down big against Penn State, they're just going to run the ball, run the clock out. Can't stop them. Game basically over from the jump. So they beat themselves in the first quarter, and I've seen ACC schools do this time and time again. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, Jordan, what you're missing is when the ACC competes against the ACC, the teams they're playing against, other ACC schools, obviously, they're not as talented, so those opponents are not forcing them to make mistakes. That's not what I'm talking about, though. What I'm talking about is when SMU plays against a team outside of the ACC, they make errors that are just self-inflicted. For instance, in the second half today, like we talked earlier, he threw some interceptions just right in the chest of some Penn State players. I watched him all season. He was threading the needle against all, like if he played against Wake Forest, he could thread the needle between 2 linebackers and 2 safeties, just perfect throw. And people are like, wow, you see that arm string? And then he plays against a team today, and he's just throwing it right into the chest of a defender. And it's like, how did he not see him? Like that kind of stuff drives me crazy. Second half, you see the SMU quarterback Jennings. They have 2, they were on like the 6-yard line. It was like 2nd and goal or something like that. And then they have a delay game. They had 2 penalties in a row. I think it was a delay game and a false start. It might have been 2 false starts in a row. And it's like, y'all have not been sloppy like that all year. And now all of a sudden, you can't even do 2 plays without having back-to-back penalties. It's crazy. It's crazy how that works. So that's why I say like the ACC is just so annoying to me. I'm a huge Hurricanes fan. I've seen teams play against the Hurricanes, or I've seen teams play against Florida State. They're making one-hand catches. They're doing all this crazy stuff, and their quarterback is throwing perfect dimes 50 yards down the field. And once they play against a team outside of the ACC, they're overthrowing everything. They're not seeing zone coverage sitting right in the middle of the field. It's just like all these self-defeating things. I don't understand it, but that's why I say the annoying Coastal Conference. Whenever there's 2 different versions of every ACC team. One version is how they look against ACC schools. The other version of every ACC school is how they look against SEC and Big Ten schools. There's 2 different versions of every ACC school. I'm telling you, just pay attention to it next year. You'll see what I'm saying makes sense. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is the College Football Playoff Committee and how they look right now after the couple of games that I've seen. So I've watched Notre Dame beat the brakes off of Indiana, and then I saw Penn State annihilate SMU. So how does this make the College Football Playoff Committee look? In my eyes, it makes them look really fraudulent, and it makes people like me say, y'all have got to tell us what we're doing here. Are we looking to put the best 12 teams in there, or are we trying to put teams in that earned it all season? Like, are we looking for the teams that earned it, or the teams that are the best 12? Because I honestly believe my Hurricanes would have done a far better job than Indiana and SMU. I believe that. I also believe South Carolina would have done a better job than both of those teams. There's 4 or 5 other teams that I can think of that just would have done a better job than Indiana. These are the two games that I've seen so far. Indiana, which I thought they were overmatched. I didn't think Notre Dame was a really good team. I thought Indiana was overmatched before the game started, and once the game got in play, I'm like, yep, overmatched. I thought SMU was overmatched before the game started, and once we were like a quarter and a half in, I'm like, yep, overmatched. And when I say teams that are the best 12, or the teams that have quote unquote earned it, when you talk about teams that have earned it, you look at a team like Indiana. They have one loss on the season, and it's like, okay, they beat all the teams they're supposed to beat by a lot, actually. They lost one game that most people expected them to lose, but they looked somewhat competitive. So it's like, yeah, they've earned it. But when you look at Indiana in the same situation with SMU, you're like, yeah, they beat all the teams they were supposed to beat. They lost to two, so they played two teams that were decent, which was BYU and Clemson, and they lost both of those games. But you look at their situation, you go, okay, they played all the teams that were on their schedule. They beat BYU, or they lost to BYU, but they beat every other team. They earned their way into the ACC championship, and they lost a close game in the ACC championship. So you could say, well, they've earned their opportunity to be in there, so let's go ahead and put them in there. But when you watch the tape and you look at the game, like when you look at Penn State's offensive line compared to SMU's defensive line, it wasn't even close. Just the size was just totally different. When you look at Penn State's defensive line, when you look at their defensive ends, you compare them to what we saw SMU putting on their offensive line, it was no comparison. So the game was over from the jump, just in the trenches alone. And then when you look at Indiana, they just didn't have the skill players to compete with a school like Notre Dame. They certainly don't have the skill positions to compete against a team like Oregon, who I think is the only really good team in college football. I think all the other ones that are in the playoffs are pretty good teams. I think Oregon is the one team that is a very good team. But when you just look at these schools, we look at the difference in what you see on the trenches. One side of the ball, we have Penn State offensive linemen are just monsters, and you look at the other side with SMU's defensive linemen, which are a lot of players who weren't good enough to play at Miami, who didn't even make the playoffs. Like when you look at that, it's like, yeah, they might have earned it, quote unquote, but are they one of the 12 best teams? Even if you take Miami out of the situation, like I know there's bias there, but if you take Miami out of the situation, South Carolina, their defensive line, their offensive line, I think could have made Indiana or SMU look childish today, because SMU is just not on that level. That's just my thoughts on it. Let me know y'all's thoughts. Penn State versus SMU, did you think it looked as one-sided as I thought, or do you think it was just a couple of bad plays by the quarterback that just ruined the game from the jump? Also, have y'all not realized, or have you not noticed this annoying thing that I've noticed from the ACC schools, where they seem to play perfectly against ACC opponents, but then when they play against everybody outside the conference, they just tend to lay down or get overwhelmed and do things that beat themselves. And then the last thing I want you to know, let me know in the comment section is, what's your thought on the college football playoff committee so far, just based on the games that you've watched up to this point? Do you think they put the wrong teams in? And if so, which teams do you think should have been in, and which teams do you think should not have been included at all? All right, that's all that I got for you today. I appreciate you watching the video. I appreciate the ongoing prayers once again. You could be anywhere in the world, but you're here with me, and I truly appreciate that. So take care. God bless.